Mahammadim. You've changed things. Forever. There's no going back. See, to them, you're just a freak. Like me.
The reason I would like to give a few examples from the New Testament is to show the standards Christians have with regards to so-called fulfillment of prophecies, especially since Dr. Brown often boasts and takes pride in these so-called prophecies. While a Muslim would have no issue with Jesus being foretold in the Tanakh, as we believe in his prophethood, nevertheless, we do not close our eyes when it comes to blatant manufacturing of so-called messianic prophecies. Let me give a couple examples. Number one, Matthew, for example, made up a story about Herod massacring the kids in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. Not only have historians such as Josephus, who wrote in great deal about the atrocities committed by Herod, not mentioned this, but what makes this even worse is that Luke contradicts this when he says that Jesus was born at the time of the census in the year 6 CE, 10 years after Herod had died. Moreover, Matthew also claims that due to Herod, Jesus had to flee to Egypt to fulfill Hosea 11. But when one reads Hosea 11, it is clear this is speaking about the children of Israel at the time of the Exodus. Once again, Luke contradicts this event. Thus we know Matthew made this up to make Jesus look like Moses. Number two, in the Gospel of John, it is claimed that Jesus is the Lamb of God. The Synoptic Gospels make no such claim. Yet the Gospel of John not only changes the day Jesus was allegedly crucified, but also the time Jesus was crucified in order to prove Jesus is the Lamb of God. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus ate the Passover meal and died the next day. But John instead has Jesus die on the day of preparation for the Passover. Once again, the biography of Jesus is being changed to fulfill alleged prophecies. So now that we have seen the level of so-called prophecies Christians such as Dr. Brown believe in and promote, we can now have a look at biblical prophecies of Prophet Muhammad on whom be peace and give a comparison.
And it's so interesting to see that in a debate that focused on one issue only, as Muhammad in the Bible started with an attack on the New Testament. That alone tells you the arguments that will follow are very weak.
Dr. Brown said, I started with an attack on the New Testament. No, I just showed the New Testament standard for prophecies so we can compare it with what I brought. I didn't have to change the biography of Prophet Muhammad to claim fulfillment like John did to make Jesus look like the Lamb of God, and like Matthew did when he made up a story to make it look like Jesus was like Moses because Pharaoh killed the kids when Moses was born, and the same thing with Jesus. So that's why I mentioned that, just to show the standard of Christian prophecies. So that's connected to the birth of Jesus. Anyway, if they're changing the biography of Jesus, then quoting the New Testament, like, oh, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, like Micah 5:2 says, isn't really going to cut it.
As for the reliability of the New Testament, of course, its historical accuracy is well known and widely heralded, but that's not what the debate's about today. Josephus is one ancient Jewish historian, Matthew is another, and with Matthew records about Herod's ruthlessness is very typical of who the man is. And Matthew wrote it for people who lived back then. He was not creating things out of the blue that anyone would know weren't true. I'm not here to tell you that Barack Obama is the Prime Minister of England and hope you don't catch the error. So the gospel writers were writing for people who lived then and knew the stories, not for people 2,000 years later that would try to take issue with it. As for Matthew's citations, it's amazing how deep and rich he is. He's assuming when he quotes Hosea 11:1 that I called my son out of Egypt, he's assuming that his Jewish readers know the whole verse, which is not a prophecy, but it's about Israel in the past. Just as Israel, God's firstborn son, was called out of Egypt, so also the Messiah, God's firstborn son, is called out of Egypt. He's assuming they know that. It is so rich and deep and beautiful and wonderful to unfold.
Then Dr. Brown mentions the historical accuracy of Matthew in line with Herod's character, writing for the people who knew the stories. And Hosea 11, he was looking at a deeper meaning out of him coming out of Egypt. No, Matthew didn't know that he was going to put in a New Testament along with Luke, John, and Mark, and Hebrews, and Philippians, and Colossians. Matthew wrote to his people, but then Luke came next to him and contradicted him. So it's not just about Josephus. Luke rules out that Jesus went into Egypt, and he ruled out Herod's massacre, because Luke makes it clear that Jesus was born according to the time of the census, 10 years after Herod died. Thank you very much. I want Dr. Brown to tell us, why did John change the day Jesus died to make him look like the Passover lamb? I want Dr. Brown to tell us, why did Matthew have to make up a story about Herod? No, he says that that's the character of Herod. If I know that Donald Trump is a weirdo and I want to make up a story about him, I'm going to make it in line with what we know about Trump anyway to make it more believable. If Herod massacred kids and Jesus went to Egypt to fulfill Hosea 11, which is talking about a past event, how on earth is Luke correct in that Jesus was born 10 years after Herod died, according to the time of the census? And by the way, the census didn't even affect Galilee. So even if Herod was alive and there was a census, they didn't have to leave Galilee because the census was for Judea and they were living in Galilee. So the story is false. And as far as Egypt, how can they have gone to Egypt after Herod did the massacre when, according to Luke, 40 days later, they went to the temple, purified Jesus, and went straight to Galilee? So I want answers to this. So you laugh and joke about us Muslims. I didn't have to twist nothing. Whereas Matthew has to change the biography of Jesus. John has to change the biography of Jesus. Mike Licona, one of the leading Christian apologists regarding John changing the day, he says, John, in his debate with Bar Ehrman in 2009, he said, John changed things for theological reasons.
And that's why you do have some of the discrepancies, like the day Jesus was crucified. I think that John probably altered the day in order for to make a theological point there. But that doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't crucified.
So I enjoyed Dr. Brown's 5-volume books. But it amazes me that Dr. Brown's boasting about messianic prophecy left, right, and center when the gospel writers are changing the biography of Jesus to make him fulfill prophecies. But then you want to joke with us Muslims. With all due respect, I think the joke's the other way around.
So first I want to thank my colleague here for spending the bulk of his time attacking the New Testament. Why? Because there's not an argument based on is Muhammad prophesied in the Bible. It's quite remarkable that I'm now being asked to defend alleged contradictions in the New Testament that have been answered endlessly in various scholastic volumes. That's not the subject of the debate. Never was, not why I'm here. If you want to do a separate debate with a New Testament scholar on reliability of the New Testament, great. But we came with one very explicit purpose. And notice how from the opening to the end, it's been deviated from, right? Because there is no possible argument he can make that stands on its own. Let's break a few things. And if you want issues about the time of the census, go to Darrell Bock's commentary on Luke or Craig Keener's commentary on Luke. Issues of alleged contradictions in John, go to Craig Keener's commentary on John. There's abundant evidence. Those aren't even things that we're here to discuss.
And as far as the details of these prophecies, I've been working on a book for the last 3 years called Abraham Fulfilled, which is going to show from Genesis to Malachi and include the Paraclete, how all of this fits together, and it's better than the New Testament's attempts of proving prophecies for Jesus. There was no response to Matthew changing the biography of Jesus. Dr. Brown said, oh, you could check these scholars. Dr. Brown appealed to F.F. Bruce regarding this issue in his book. F.F. Bruce tried to suggest twisting the Greek, which Daniel Wallace even said, twisting the Greek to get around the problem. So this is the type of scholarship needed to deal with these. Mike Licona said, John changed things for theological reasons to make Jesus look like the Passover lamb. So I'm sorry, but if my argument was impossible a week, it was better than Matthew's arguments. It was better than the New Testament's arguments. So I'm sorry, but there's no doubt that Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, is the messenger of the covenant. Herod died 10 years before the census. So the time Luke claims Jesus was born was 10 years after Herod had died. So the question remains, why did Matthew make this story up? So this is what Raymond Brown writes: we cannot resolve satisfactorily the major objections, namely the one and only one and only census conducted while Quirinius was legate in Syria affected only Judea, not Galilee, and took place in AD 67, a good 10 years after the death of Herod the Great. Here now, this is Dr. Brown's book. Here this is what he says about two scholars. One's name's Dale Allison and the other one's name is W.D. Davies, who together wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. This is what he writes about them. The learned scholars who produced the most exhaustive, technical, and linguistically detailed commentary on Matthew to date, totaling over 2,300 pages, recognize the depth of Matthew's hermeneutics. So he's given these scholars their due. He's mentioned that they're some of the most learned, and they've produced the best commentary on Matthew's gospel, and they understand how Matthew worked. This is what Davies writes, who was just praised by Dr. Brown. There are no historical records of any attempt by Herod to murder the children of Bethlehem. The story was invented by Matthew, in part to construct a parallel between the early life of Jesus and the early life of Moses, and in part to provide a motive for the Holy Family to enter Egypt, so that they might, upon leaving Egypt, fulfill a prophecy. So these scholars that he praises as who write in one of the best commentaries in modern times on the Gospel of Matthew, themselves are admitting Matthew made up the story to make Jesus look like Moses and to provide a motive to make him go into Egypt, to make him come out, to make him look like Moses, and to make him like the true Israel, which is what Dr. Brown was on about. This is the scholars that he himself praises.
חיכו ממתקים וכולו מחמדים, מחמדים, מחמדים.
Once again I shall shake the nations, ve'yavu himdath kol hagoyim, and himda of all nations shall come here. And the glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former. And in this place I will give shalom, or salam, din de shlama in Syriac, dinul Islam in Arabic. The Hebrew himda, translated most desired, is etymologically identical to Ahmad, and Ahmad is the superlative form of the name Muhammad, which means the most praised, the most desired, the most coveted, the most lovely, so on and so forth.
قل يا أهل الكتاب لا تغلوا في دينكم غير الحق ولا تتبعوا أهواء قوم قد ضلوا من قبل وأضلوا كثيرا وضلوا عن سواء السبيل.